Cars Garage. In this video, I'll be working on the XRAY XB2C 22 edition, and I'll be building the shocks in step 6 or bag 6. Let's get started. So bag 6 is actually going to be two different bags. They put the springs in a separate bag, so just take note of that. Be careful when opening this bag, 7.9. It has a lot of small parts. It's got the O-rings and seals for the shocks, as well as the C-clips. So you don't want to lose any of those, because if you do, you're going to have to wait until you can get some replacements. So before we do anything, let's get all of our shock shafts together, because what I'm going to do now is polish these up in the same manner I polished the hinge pins. They don't look like they're coated. I mean, it's pretty smooth, but I feel like if you polish it up with that Never Dull, it'll be even smoother, which will probably provide some better and more fluid action of the shocks. So let's start off with that.
I'm lightly checking up on the shock shaft on the opposite end of the threads.
Those feel amazing now. Definitely worth the extra step. Don't know if it's going to make too big of a difference, but in my mind, I'm already here, so why not do it? Now we can get started. So first we're going to get the shock pistons off the sprues, and it looks like we used a 2-hole 1.6 millimeter for the fronts, and then we're going to use the two 1.7 millimeter for the rear, and that is just denoted by the number 6. There's a number 1, a small one, and a number 6 or number 7 on the piston. It's going to be hard to see. Kind of hard to see, but there's a number 7 and a number 6, so we can get those out. So you're going to have two different length shafts. You have a long shaft and a short shaft. So the short ones are going to be for the front. So first what we're going to do is take a C-clip and install it in the bottom channel here. And then we're going to install the piston and then another C-clip. And when you install the piston, install it with the numbering facing up. So the shock shaft, this is down, this is up. So install it with the numbering facing up. Additionally, you can take a Sharpie and kind of color the 6 to denote what piston you have in there. And go ahead and take another C-clip and install it into that groove. So that one's ready. We can move on to the next one. Now we can do the rears. And the rears are going to use the 1.7. So same thing for the rear shocks. We're going to install C-clip. And we're going to install the piston with the numbering facing upward, like we did with these two. And then we're going to install another C-clip. Now all the shock rods and pistons are done. We can prepare the shock bodies. Okay, so we're going to need some shims from this sprue. We're going to need this thick shim and thin shim, and we're going to need them for all the shocks. We need a thick and a thin for each shock, so I'm going to get those ready. So let's start off with the front shocks. I'm going to lightly put some shock fluid on the O-rings to lubricate them. And so this O-ring is 0.8 by 1, and it goes over the outside. Like so. Next, we're going to install the clear O-rings. So they look clear, they're like white. We're going to install some shock fluid on there to lubricate the O-ring, and then go ahead and install it. Then we're going to install the thin shim on top of that O-ring. Then we're going to install another clear O-ring. Put a little bit of shock fluid on there. And lastly, we're going to install the thick shim with the boss with the smaller diameter facing away from that O-ring. And lastly, we can install the bottom cap. And just slowly tighten it down. So one is ready, I'll move on to the next one. And we do the same thing for the rears. Not too happy with the quality of the machining. Pretty sharp edges, so you know it's possible that when you install this O-ring you can cut it. So time will tell whether or not that O-ring got nicked and if it will leak. Alright, now we can install the shock shafts into the bodies. So we have our shorter bodies with the shorter shock shafts, and the proper way to install these is to rotate them as you install, so that way you don't damage the O-rings. Just like so. It's kind of weird, this piece, this shock body, looks like it's stained or something's inside, and it won't come out. So don't know about that. I think it's just in the metal itself. Just doesn't look that great. Now with these shafts inserted into the shock bodies, we can prepare the shock collars so we can put them on our shock stand. Not sure if the camera will pick it up, but there's still some burrs left from the machining process on the shock collar, which actually picked some of the burrs off. So look at that. I was just touching it and a big burr just came off. Luckily it didn't splinter me. Same with this. Still have machining like chips in the packaging. Nothing I can do about that. Alright, so we're gonna take the large O-rings, which are 0.14 by 1.5, and we're gonna add some silicone oil to it. And then we're going to install them inside the shock collars. Even on this cap here, it's gonna be might be hard to see. But there is a very tiny burr, almost looks like a hair. Just broke off. But that was inside the thread and it got anodized, so hopefully it goes on the shock body smoothly and doesn't mess it up. Just very poor machining quality, especially for the price of this kit. I'm kind of surprised. Now we can thread these shock collars onto the shock bodies. We can trim any plastic off the shock caps. Looks like there's a little nub still there. Alright, so I'm going to add some fluid onto the O-rings that go inside the shock cap, and then install it all the way down in there. Make sure it's seated all the way. You can set that aside. Alright, so let's prep the rod ends for the shocks. Alright, now you can use your shock tool to hold the shaft and screw on the rod ends. Looks like there are some upstop C-shims. So the front uses two 1mm shims, and the rear are going to use two 2mm shims. So they're on these sprues. So basically going to use all of the ones that came with the kit. These are small, so if you're going to try to trim off the nub, just be careful so you don't cut yourself. Looks like the best method to take these nubs off is just use a nail file and sand it down. So the longer rear shocks are going to use two 2.5 shims. And the fronts are going to use two 1mm shims. Next, what we're going to do is make sure that the front shock length that is showing fully extended is 24mm. So from this edge to this edge, it's 24mm. We're at 23.59, so we can take our shock tool and unscrew so that one is at 24. We're going to measure the next one. Now the rears need to be 29mm from shoulder to shoulder. And that one is perfect. All the shock lengths are exactly what they need to be. And now we can fill the shocks up. So we've got our front shocks and rear shocks. The front shocks are going to take the 500 CST oil, and the rear shocks we're going to use 450 CST oil. So go ahead and fill up your shocks almost all the way to the top. Maybe leave about 2mm from the top. We're going to put 450 in the rear. And now what we're going to do with each shock is we're going to bring the piston almost all the way up, right before it reaches the top of the fluid level, and then we're going to go back down. And that way it'll help bring any air that might be trapped under the piston to the top. We're going to do that a few times, about 5 times. and then leave the piston all the way down. And then let that shock rest for 30 minutes or so. So you can see that one had a lot of bubbles below the piston. And do the rest the same way. Now we can let those shocks sit for about 30 minutes and then come back. Alright, so the shocks have been sitting overnight and there's no air left in the shocks. So we can start the bleeding procedure. So we can make sure the shocks are full. So next what we can do is install the shock caps. So with the shock caps on, we can start the bleeding procedure. You're gonna wanna get a microfiber towel or some paper towels to make sure that it doesn't get too messy, and get your 1.5 millimeter hex driver ready, along with the M2 by 5 screws for the bleeder screw. And what we're going to do now is kind of wrap the shock up with the microfiber towel. And what we're going to do is we're going to gently push the shock shaft up into the shock body and let any excess fluid come out of the bleeder hole. Alright. Alright, with the shock body or the shock completely compressed, we can install the bleeder screw. And just slowly tighten it down until it shoulders up. Now what we're going to do is we're going to cycle the shaft up and down, maybe about 10 times, and then re-bleed the screw. So if there's any built-in pressure, we can remove that. So now we remove the screw. And we bleed again. And now we can reinstall the bleeder screw. Now what we want to do is check, make sure the rebound is practically zero, which it is. So we need to do that for all those other shocks. Alright, so now we can assemble the shocks. Since they're all bled, we're going to need 4 of the spring retaining collars. So the long springs will go on the back of the car, so on the longer shock bodies. So all you have to do to install it is make sure that your stops are near the top of the shaft, like so. Install your spring, compress the spring, and install your spring retaining cup, just like so. There's no mention of what this distance should be. I don't know if that's something that will be explained later, but as always, you're gonna have to check your ride height anyway, so don't worry about the adjustments just yet. Next, we can install the balls for the shocks. So the silver looking ones are gonna go on the bottom of the tie rod end. And then you're going to install the dark gray ones on the top. Before we do that, just want to check the orientation. I like to have the bleeder screws facing to the outside of the car. So we just need to install one in each direction. So one on each side means you have the flat side and the bleeder screw on the opposite sides. So that concludes step 6 or bag 6. Thanks for watching. Please leave a comment down below if you have any suggestions on this part. If you found this helpful, please like and subscribe, and stay tuned for the next video where I complete the final assembly. Thanks. See you all in the next one.